Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights when the air was still, and everything seemed too quiet. The large, sprawling suburban house had a neatly trimmed lawn. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was a paradise for any kid. It had a TV, a pool table, and video games. It was the kind of place where you forgot about everything outside, and we were living the dream. We sprawled out on the big leather couch, watching horror movies on TV and munching on potato chips. Chase had started dozing off. I was wrestling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety. I usually felt sleeping over at a friend's house, but tonight it was different. Much worse. It was probably past midnight when I heard it. A creak as a door slowly opened. I glanced behind the couch and saw something that unnerved me. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened on its own. Chase, groggy and half asleep, muttered something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted he come with me to close it. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch and fell asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. A little later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a noise that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an incredibly unsettling expression. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed. Chase jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the man moving toward us. In a panic, we ran. The basement had two exits. One led upstairs to the front door, and the other was a sliding door to the patio. We split up. I ran toward the patio door while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping, I quickly called the police, blurting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled around the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His screams were desperate, terrified cries for help. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man wrapping his arms around Chase's neck, choking him. His face twisted into a horrific expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face red, struggling to breathe. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the intruder's head. The man collapsed onto the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had been just minutes ago. We stayed silent, too afraid to speak. I peered out the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. I just knew I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly crossing the yard, his movements deliberate, as he headed toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." The two of us backed into a corner of the small treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. The creak of the ladder. He was climbing. I could feel his weight pressing on the structure as the treehouse swayed slightly with each step. Chase looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox. Chase's dad had left here months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, clutching it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the metal rod down with all my strength. The man let out a cry of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we climbed down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind was racing. Where could we go? And I knew it wouldn't be long before he got back up. Gasping for air, I dragged Chase to the side of the house where thick bushes and overgrown trees obscured us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood there, cautiously peeking out from the bushes. I signaled Chase to follow me. We darted toward the path as the police car stopped. Relief washed over me as two officers got out, immediately surveying the area. I yelled, "He's still there! He's..." Before I could finish, the man stepped out of the shadows, emerging from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more calculated. Blood dripped from the gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept moving toward us, his eyes fixed on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing to walk slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. A gunshot from the officers rang out, tearing through the night. The man staggered, collapsing onto the ground, gasping his last breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. Finally, it seemed like it was really over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter who had been living in abandoned houses around the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found an old, crumpled photograph. It was Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to pick us up. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It was a reminder that true horror doesn't always come from the dark. It can stand right behind you, watching. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow. I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over, but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me, full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden, sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man, the truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive. The obsession with the house by the quarry. Tom's family moved to an old house near a quarry in Minnesota. He had a new job in a small town, and his family would stay there for a few weeks. Boxes were scattered across the hardwood floor. Emily sat by the fireplace, arranging her stuffed animal collection. Evi, his wife, sat in a chair, sipping tea and watching their daughter. Meanwhile, Tom was organizing tools in the corner of the room. But sometimes, the silence in the house was too heavy. The creaking of the wooden floor beneath their feet sounded louder than it should. The house fell silent, save for the faint howling wind outside. Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His gaze turned toward the window. For a moment, Tom saw her, a shadowy figure of a woman with milky white eyes staring at him through the glass. Tom sat up in alarm. When he looked back, she was gone. Then Emily screamed. They rushed to her room. She was sitting on her bed, her tiny body trembling, her wide eyes filled with tears. She pointed under the bed and said,
"She's under the bed, the woman with the white eyes. She wants me to hide under the bed."
Tom bent down and looked under the bed, but saw nothing. They reassured Emily that it was just a nightmare, but something about her description made them uneasy. To ease her fear, the next day, they installed a small hidden camera in her room. What they discovered that night sent chills down their spines. On the screen, they watched her fitful sleep together. Hours passed without incident, until, suddenly, the blanket began sliding off her, as if pulled by invisible hands. The little girl's small body shifted toward the edge of the bed, slowly as if being dragged. Then suddenly, she was yanked down violently. She fell off the bed and was pulled under it, disappearing from their view. They rushed to her and found her curled up on the floor, crying in fear. Tom opened the live feed on his phone. On the screen, a faint silhouette of a girl was hiding under the bed. She was crawling, hiding under Emily's bed. Her hollow, black eyes stared directly at the camera. Emily's fear was unrelenting. She clung to her parents and refused to be alone. They decided to stay in the living room that night. As they sat on the sofa, the lights began to flicker. Then a cold hand brushed against Evi's cheek. She screamed in terror, but when she turned around, nothing was there. Emily screamed as one of her toys rolled into the room and stopped at her feet. Tom realized everything was spiraling out of control. He needed to grab the car keys from the bedside table. When he reached the bedroom, in the mirror, he saw her standing there, grinning maliciously. Tom grabbed the keys and ran back to the living room. They rushed to the front door, but it slammed shut as they reached it. The back door was their only chance. As they ran through the kitchen, glass shattered all around them. Everything seemed to be trying to stop them from leaving. With a desperate kick, the door burst open. As they got outside, Emily pointed toward the house. In the upstairs window, she, the figure with sunken eyes, was watching them leave. They got to the car and quickly drove away. They sat in silence, knowing they would never return to that house. The house on the edge of the quarry remains, holding its secrets. For the family, it is a memory they will never escape. Echoes from the haunted shop. It all began as a challenge. Every town has one, a haunted location that no one dares to enter after dark. For their city, it was an old fast food restaurant that had closed down years ago after a string of mysterious deaths. Now, it stood there, decaying at the corner of the street. For years, stories surrounded the place. Customers disappeared, strange noises echoed at night, and lights flickered inside despite no power. Some even claimed the place was cursed. The building loomed before them, weeds sprouting through cracks in the sidewalk, and an old, rusty delivery truck sat in a distant corner. The neon sign had long since died, but somehow, even in its decay, it emitted an eerie glow under the moonlight. They approached the door, and James pushed it open without hesitation. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. A foul odor immediately assaulted their noses, a rotten mixture of mold and something much worse, something decaying. But as she stepped inside, Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. Her eyes darted around, wide with anticipation. Inside, the scene was worse than expected. It looked frozen in time, as if everyone had left one day and never returned. Dust covered the wrapping counter and old trays lay scattered on the floor. Then, a flickering light appeared at the back, something that shouldn't have been on. As there was no power here, they moved toward the kitchen, where most of the rumors originated. They said a corpse had been found here. As they approached the kitchen door, the overhead light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. James gave a nervous smile. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty appliances were caked with grease. The tiled floor was cracked, and dark stains splattered the walls. They began to hear whispering growing louder, coming from the old cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah stepped closer and peered inside. Something caught her attention, a reflection. At the back of the cold storage room, behind the shelves, was a mirror. The strange thing was they had never seen a mirror inside a cold storage before. And in the reflection were the two of them. But there was another dark shadow standing right behind Sarah and James. She turned around abruptly, but the room was empty. But in the mirror, they could both see her. A woman. She stood just a few feet away, her sunken eyes and skeletal face staring at them hungrily. In fear, they turned to leave, but the cold storage door slammed shut with a deafening noise. Darkness seemed to engulf them. She didn't dare look back, feeling a chilling presence as if she were right there behind her. Sarah fumbled for her phone, desperately seeking light, and when she turned on the flashlight, everything only got worse. In the beam of light, Sarah saw her face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was pale, eyes rolled back, emaciated, and her skin seemed to crack. Her bony fingers brushed against Sarah's skin. And then, suddenly, as quickly as it had started, she vanished. Before she could regain her composure, in the corner of the room, hidden among boxes and discarded trays, something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, pointing with a trembling finger. It was a woman lying on the floor, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was still decaying. She thought it couldn't be simple. Perhaps it was a murder. There was no time to think anymore. They hurriedly left the place. Sarah trembled. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call 911. A while later, they arrived to cordon off and investigate the abandoned place. Then they heard an announcement from a detective. The woman they found matched the missing person they were searching for. Her family had reported her missing just 2 days prior. A chill ran down their spines as they heard his words. Realizing they had just encountered the victim of an unsolved case made the atmosphere feel heavy. Returning home, even now in the silence of the room, they sometimes heard whispers. They thought perhaps this wasn't a place to explore. There's always a reason why places like this have rumors, and they often stem from real dangers. The mystery behind a portrait. Moving in with Eric was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, but the moment she crossed the threshold, an unsettling chill enveloped her. Jamie's gaze settled on a large painting, prominently displayed in the living room. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and piercing eyes. From the moment she saw it, she felt deeply uneasy. The woman's eyes seemed strangely alive. Jamie shivered, feeling the weight of those eyes on her. She thought it was watching her. She glanced at Eric, who was arranging painting supplies nearby.
It's just a painting, Jamie.
He reassured her with a soft laugh, but something inside her didn't agree. As Jamie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the woman's piercing gaze. It felt as though the woman in the painting wanted to tell her something. Then one night, she had a nightmare, the woman stepping out of the painting. A cold hand gripped her arm, and the woman in the painting whispered one chilling word.
Run.
Jamie jolted awake in panic. She could still feel her presence in the room, her eyes burning into Jamie. After another sleepless night, she asked Eric to move the painting out of their shared space, and reluctantly he agreed. He moved it to his office, but the unease remained, growing with each passing day. Instead of feeling relieved, things only got worse. He spent hours in his office with the painting, muttering to himself in soft, frantic whispers. When he appeared, his arms were scratched and bruised, as if he had fought with something or someone. Jamie's suspicion grew. One night, after Eric had fallen asleep, Jamie gathered her courage and snuck into his office, determined to uncover what was going on. As Jamie got closer to the painting on the wall, the woman's eyes now looked fiercer than ever. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to take a photo with her phone. Jamie began researching the image. Her heart sank as she found an old article. The woman in the painting was real, a young woman named Anna who had disappeared years ago. The last person seen with her alive was her boyfriend, who also vanished without a trace. She looked closer at the image of Anna. There was an eerie coincidence: her earrings. They were identical to the pair Eric had given her on their 1-month anniversary. With fear rising, Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for more clues. She noticed a white cloth over an easel, as if Eric was preparing to start a new painting. But what caught her attention was a knife lying next to his paintbrushes. Suddenly, Jamie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned back to the painting, and this time, Anna's expression had changed. Her mouth twisted and moved, forming the exact word Jamie had heard in her nightmare.
Run.
Jamie turned around, panic engulfing her. Eric was standing in the doorway, his face darkened with anger. He began asking her what she was doing there. Jamie backed away, but he continued advancing, gripping the knife tightly and saying that she knew too much. As he raised the knife, Jamie bolted, running down the hallway as fast as she could. She ran toward the door, fumbling with her phone to dial 911. But Eric was faster. He grabbed her by the neck just as she reached the front door, pulling her back with terrifying strength. Just when she thought it was all over, she heard sirens blaring outside. The police burst in. They quickly subdued Eric, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed and screamed in rage. While searching the house, the police found ample evidence behind a hidden door in Eric's basement. Behind it was a small, dusty room filled with Anna's belongings. But the most chilling discovery was Anna's decaying body hidden in Eric's basement. Finally, her spirit was set free. Before leaving, Jamie returned to Eric's office one last time. Anna's painting still hung on the wall. Her eyes were gentle, her face no longer twisted in fear or sorrow. Instead, she looked at Jamie with gratitude. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. Night at the gas station. That night, snow fell, freezing cold. The wind howled as I drove into the parking lot of the gas station where I worked the night shift. I had been doing this job for a few months now, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., as it fit my personal schedule. My coworker's car was the only other vehicle in the lot. I parked next to it, bracing myself for a long night. Nothing but slow hours and an empty store ahead. After greeting my coworker and taking over his shift, I was alone for the rest of the night. As soon as the door closed behind him, I glanced at the task list my manager had left. It was short, just a few tasks that would take less than an hour to complete. Around midnight, a car pulled into the station, catching my attention. It was an old SUV, pulling up to one of the gas pumps. I glanced out the window for a moment before turning back to my phone. A few minutes passed, then 10. I glanced again, surprised to see the SUV still parked there. The headlights were off, the doors closed, but no one had come in to pay or use the restroom. A strange feeling began to creep over me. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the freezing cold, the wind biting into my skin. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the SUV. I peered through the window, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" But from what I could see through the frosted glass, the car was empty. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the growing unease. There was no one in the SUV. But why would someone leave a car parked there, engine off, in freezing temperatures like this? I glanced down and noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow. They led away from the car, but not toward the front of the station. Instead, They extend toward the corner of the gas station. It was too cold for someone to just walk off and disappear like that. I hurried back inside to warm up. Once inside, I turned on the small heater next to the counter. Then a loud noise came from the back of the building. I turned around, looking through the rows of shelves in the station. Empty, nothing there. Slowly, I started walking toward the noise coming from the back of the gas station. There on the floor were small puddles of dirty water, the kind that could only come from melted snow. I followed the trail, leading me to the storage room in the back. I stopped at the door, and in the dim light of the storage room, I saw a figure half hidden among the shelves. He was standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard that gave him a disheveled, intimidating look. He was staring right at me. I stood frozen, trembling. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How did he get in? Then he moved slightly, stepping forward. Instinctively, I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for anything to defend myself with. My fingers touched a metal crowbar leaning against the wall. I gripped it tightly. I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" But he didn't answer. As I raised the crowbar, the cold metal felt heavy in my hand. I warned him, telling him to back off or I'd call the police. He took another step forward. I screamed louder in desperation, "I'm warning you." I swung the crowbar through the air. He staggered back, slipping on the wet floor. He groaned, clutching his leg as if he twisted it in pain. The opportunity was there, and I didn't miss it. I bolted back to the front of the store. I ran to the counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I picked up the store phone and whispered to 911 for help. Every second felt like an hour as I waited. My eyes locked on the storage room door. When the police arrived, I pointed them to the back. 2 officers cautiously entered, flashlights raised as they swept the storage room. I expected to hear them shout out, telling me they'd found him, but instead, they emerged with puzzled looks on their faces. They found wet footprints leading out the back door, disappearing into the snow-covered forest behind the gas station. They followed the trail, but the vast, dark expanse seemed to swallow everything. He had vanished, leaving only a mystery. The SUV had been towed away. I still work the night shift, but every time I hear a noise from the back or see a car pull into the station, I get more cautious. He could be out there, watching, waiting. But one thing is certain, I was lucky to survive that night. Night at the gas station, the return. The memory of that snowy night still lingers in my mind. It's been over 2 weeks, and the police are still searching for him. Since then, unease has stayed with me. I've become more cautious, more aware of every detail. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. Light snow fell tonight, and the parking lot was empty. No cars, no customers, only the constant hum of the station lights and the heater struggling to keep the cold at bay. I gazed out the window, just like I had every night since then. I decided to keep busy with the small tasks my manager had left me. Stocking shelves, wiping the counter, anything to keep my mind occupied. As I bent down to organize some snacks, I heard it. A soft creaking sound from the back. It was the same sound I had heard that night, the one that led me to the storage room. I stood up slowly, waiting, listening for more. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I began to relax, headlights swept across the parking lot. A car slowly pulled in. It was the same type of SUV again. I froze, watching it stop near the gas pump. I grabbed my coat, knowing I couldn't avoid this. A feeling of dread crept over me as if everything was about to happen again. I stepped outside, the cold wind biting my face as I approached the SUV. I cautiously peered inside. This time, there was someone inside. A man wearing a thick coat, his face partially obscured by a knit hat. I asked, "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond right away. He slowly turned his head, his movements deliberate. Then he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "I'm here for what I left behind." Before I could respond, he opened the car door and stepped out. He was tall and moved toward me, and instinctively, I took a step back. I ran inside, slamming the door shut. My fingers fumbled for my phone to call the police. I gasped as I told them, "He's back. The man from before. Please send help." I glanced around, looking for the crowbar I had used before. It was leaning against the wall near the counter. I grabbed it tightly as I heard the man approach the entrance. The door rattled as he tried the handle, but it was locked. Then I heard him move toward the back door. I crept toward the storage room. The back door was still shut, but I knew he was out there. I could hear him moving, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Suddenly, the door handle began to shake. I backed away, gripping the crowbar. The door creaked open slowly, letting in a rush of cold air. I could see his silhouette. It was still him. The scruffy beard, the broad shoulders. His eyes fixed on me, wild and crazed. This time, I didn't wait. I swung the crowbar. He ducked, barely dodging the blow. I swung again, and this time, I hit his arm. He groaned in pain, staggering back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he lunged at me, grabbing the crowbar with a force I didn't expect. The metal slipped from my hands and fell to the ground. I stumbled back. Then I saw my chance the exit, and I ran as fast as I could toward him. I ran outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. I could hear him behind me. I sprinted toward the forest, needing to get away from him. Branches whipped against my face as I rushed into the woods, the cold biting into my skin, causing sharp pain. I tripped. My foot caught in a tree root hidden beneath the snow. It sapped all the strength out of me. I tried to get up, but before I could move, I felt his hand grab my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked out, sending him staggering with a cry of pain. I got up and kept running toward the edge of the woods. In the distance, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. I collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, pointing toward the forest. "He's still in there." At that moment, he came running out of the woods as the police closed in. For a split second, the crazed smile on his face vanished. He turned to run, but it was too late. The police were right in front of him. He thrashed and squirmed violently as they wrestled him to the ground and cuffed him. The SUV had been towed away, and the man was gone, but the unease remained. The store was quiet again. I walked to the door, staring out at the now empty parking lot. I didn't know why he had come back, what he was after, or what he thought he'd left behind, but I hoped it would be the last time I saw him. Pharmacy obsession. It was a quiet evening. Lily had been working as a pharmacy technician for a few years. It was a simple job, filling prescriptions and dispensing medications. The pharmacy had its regular customers. Some were friendly, while others were a bit odd, but everyone got used to them. Joe was one of those regulars, a man in his mid-30s who came by often. He stood out with his long, disheveled hair and eccentric clothing. Lily had seen Joe and his elderly mother many times. She was always his caretaker, bringing Joe in to get his medication. The mix of drugs he needed included antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and a type of medicine for infectious diseases. Joe always complimented Lily and called her Kitty because she wore a pink bow hair clip. It was harmless, though strange. Lily would politely smile, chat, and give him his medication. He never made her feel unsafe. One day, Joe's mother came alone. She looked tired, older than before. She told them that Joe wasn't well. He had stopped taking his antipsychotic medication and was becoming unpredictable, sometimes even aggressive. She could no longer control him. The court had declared Joe unfit to make decisions, so he was admitted to a mental health facility. Lily felt a bit sad, missing the familiar face, but relieved knowing Joe was being taken care of. For months, they didn't see Joe. The facility's staff regularly picked up his prescriptions, and life at the pharmacy went on as usual. Then, one Friday night, everything changed. It was late. Only she and another female colleague were working. The store was quiet, as it often was on Friday nights. Lily was reading a magazine at the counter. Then, she heard a voice.
Hey, Kitty.
At first, she didn't look up. After all, she wasn't Kitty, and she figured someone in the store was talking. But then the voice came again, angrier this time.
Kitty!
Suddenly, a bloodied hand slammed onto the counter in front of Lily, startling her. It was Joe, but something was wrong. He was bleeding heavily. The counter was smeared with Joe's bloody handprint. His face was pale, his eyes wild, like he had lost his mind. Her heart raced, and she slowly backed away from him. Lily's colleague, Jane, hurried over, concerned, asking what Joe was doing there since his medication had already been picked up on Tuesday. Joe didn't answer. He just kept staring at Lily, his voice soft but filled with dangerous intensity. He said he wanted to see Kitty and that he missed her. He started moving toward the waist-high door that separated the pharmacy counter from the rest of the store. Panic rose in Lily. Jane tried to calm him down, but Joe kept repeating the same demand, saying he wanted to see Kitty and telling Lily to come closer. She shook her head, fear rising inside her. She refused Joe, saying she couldn't come closer, but he didn't stop, beginning to cry and then scream. He started climbing over the counter, his bloody hands gripping the edge, leaving deep red stains on the white surface. Jane realized things were getting out of control and told Lily to hide in the storage room. Lily slammed the door shut and locked it, listening as Joe's voice turned into full-blown screams. He was throwing things all over the store in a frenzy, grabbing whatever he could reach. Blood spattered over bottles and shelves. Jane called the store manager and quickly phoned the police. Through the crack of the door, Lily could see the chaos. A few customers had gathered, staring in shock. One of them moved as if they were about to intervene. Both Lily and Jane shouted together,
Don't touch him!
Because Joe had an infectious disease, and his blood was everywhere. Anyone who touched him would be at risk of infection. The police arrived quickly, but didn't rush in. They were wearing full protective gear gloves, masks, and all because of Joe's blood. They cautiously approached him. At first, he resisted, screaming for Lily. But finally, the police managed to sneak behind him and sedate him. Joe collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and his bloody rampage was over. The store had to be closed. A specialized cleaning crew came to disinfect everything. A few days later, after the store reopened, Joe's mother came by to apologize. Joe was then transferred to a higher security facility where he would be more closely monitored. The smell of blood and the fear still lingered in Lily's memory. She hadn't seen Joe since that night. She heard that Joe's mother had considered suing the care facility for negligence, but she didn't follow up on what happened next. She just continued her work, but she would never forget him. Stalked by the clown at the chicken shop. I was working full-time at a chicken shop. Not exactly the job I wanted, but it was enough to get by. Most evenings, I survived on leftover chicken, and then that Saturday night happened. It had been a long and exhausting day. The restaurant was packed from morning until late at night. As I was cleaning up, my feet aching, I noticed him sitting alone at a table in the corner. waving frantically. At first, I thought he wanted to order, so I walked over, trying to smile. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't a normal customer. He was a mime, grinning widely, dressed in the classic black and white striped outfit, his face painted ghostly white. He didn't say a word. He just performed. I guessed he wanted chicken and fries, so I handed him the food without thinking much about it. I was too tired to care. His expression twisted with irritation the moment I gave him the tray. His grin morphed into a frown. He suddenly stood up and threw a few fake punches into the air like a boxer. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I told him to leave, but his face darkened even more. Slowly, he raised his hand, mimicking the act of pulling something invisible from his back. He stared at me without blinking, slashing the air with the invisible object. I played along, pretending to throw an imaginary stone at him. He staggered back, clutching his head as if I had struck him, then dashed out the door. I laughed at the absurdity of it. I thought it was harmless, but I was wrong. That night, my colleague and I were walking home together. I told him about the mime, and we laughed as we walked. But as we approached the building, I saw something, or rather, someone standing in the shadows of the hallway. A figure, dressed like the mime. I froze, staring, but chalked it up to my tired imagination. A few days later, after another late shift, I stepped outside. I walked home alone, the cold wind biting into my skin. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, not even bothering to change out of my uniform. As soon as my head hit the pillow, the doorbell yanked me out of my restless sleep. Groggily, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the colleague I usually walked home with. He wore his usual green beanie, but stood with his back to the door. I mumbled as I unlocked the door. "Did you forget something again?" But when I opened it, it wasn't him. It was the mime, his face painted ghostly white, grinning at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. He bowed and slipped past me without a word, heading straight for the bag of leftover chicken on my table. I stood there, frozen, as the mime rummaged through the bag. He pulled out a chicken leg, took huge bites, chewing slowly, savoring it like some twisted parody of a meal. Then his eyes lit up. He turned to me, mimicking the act of dipping fries in ketchup, grinning like a madman. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed over, snatched the food from his hand, and yelled at him to leave. His expression darkened. He slowly reached behind his back, pulling out the invisible knife he had shown me earlier. Only this time, it wasn't imaginary. Luckily, I reacted just in time, and it only grazed my arm, leaving a small cut. I bolted out of the room, blood dripping down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster, closer. In my panic, I fumbled with the buttons, desperately pressing the close button as he charged toward me. At the last second, the elevator doors closed. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my vision blurred from pain and fear. The elevator doors finally opened in the lobby, and I staggered out, barely able to stand. My voice trembled as I called for help, and a passerby rushed over, eyes wide with fear. Someone had called 911. When the police arrived, after an hour of investigation, they told me they had searched the building but found no one matching my description, and the security footage had disappeared. He held up an evidence bag. Inside was the knife, but there were no fingerprints. They couldn't find him, but the weapon was proof that it had happened. After that, I moved away and quit my job. I couldn't step foot in that store again. But even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands shaking, and every time I see him in the corner of the room, grinning, holding that bag of chicken. horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispery, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
she said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, "Jan?" I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. Strange clown in the parking lot. It was a chilly October evening in 2016, just a few weeks before Halloween. My friends, Jake and Sarah, and I decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. After the movie, which ended around midnight, we lingered in the parking lot, chatting and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a few dim streetlights, creating long shadows that danced eerily around us. As we laughed about the horror movie we had just seen, Jake suddenly fell silent, staring behind us. We turned to see a clown standing by an old, beat-up car at the edge of the parking lot. He was dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit with a red wig and smeared white face paint. Unlike the clowns at birthday parties, this one had a sinister air about him, his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. At first, we thought it was a prank. After all, clown sightings had become a bizarre trend that year. But as he started walking towards us, the playful notion quickly vanished. His movements were slow and deliberate, and in his gloved hand, he held a balloon that bobbed menacingly with each step. Nervously, we decided to head to Jake's car, which was parked a short distance away. We tried to act casual, but our pace quickened with each step. The clown followed, maintaining a steady, unnerving pace. My heart pounded as we reached the car and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Just as we locked the doors, the clown reached the car. He leaned against the driver's side window, his face inches away from Jake's. He pressed the balloon against the glass and slowly dragged his finger down the window, leaving a streak in the condensation. We could see his eyes clearly now, cold and calculating. He tapped on the glass, the sound echoing in the silent parking lot. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. The clown then moved to the front of the car, standing directly in the headlights. He reached into his oversized pocket and pulled out a long, jagged knife. The sight of the blade sent a fresh wave of panic through us. Jake finally snapped out of his shock and started the car. The engine roared to life, and the clown took a step back, still smiling that unsettling smile. We peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and didn't stop until we were miles away, parked in front of a 24-hour diner. We sat in the car, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We debated calling the police, but without any real harm done, we doubted they'd take us seriously. In the end, we decided to keep the story to ourselves, not wanting to relive the terrifying encounter. To this day, the image of that clown and his menacing smile haunts us. We often wonder what his intentions were and shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't reached the car in time. The experience left a lasting impression, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that seem to step straight out of a nightmare. The ghost of a mother in the forest. I was never someone who truly believed in ghosts, I always thought they were just products of imagination, created to explain the unexplainable. But everything changed when I was in that cursed forest. It was supposed to be a normal overnight trip, and quite an easy one. The locals whispered about the forest being haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to that. The road was rough, and the darkness grew thicker as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights barely cut through the fog, so I had to be more careful. Then suddenly, she appeared. An old woman stood in the middle of the road, hunched over, her eyes fixed on me as I stopped. I honked, but she didn't seem to hear, so I opened the door and shouted for her to move so I could pass. She didn't react at all. Instead, she slowly turned, looked straight at me, and asked, "Have you seen my daughter?" She kept asking, her voice growing more desperate. Then suddenly walked away, sobbing, leaving me confused and shaking. In my mind, I tried to dismiss the encounter with the woman as I continued my journey, but her words kept echoing in my head, gnawing at my sanity. When I finally made it out of the forest at dawn, I stopped at a small grocery store. The shopkeeper was kind, and I chatted with him for a while. But as I looked out the window, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the forest, staring at me. Fear started to creep in, and that's when the shopkeeper told me about her. He said that she had lost her mind after a tragic accident and now wanders the forest, searching for her long-lost daughter. I dismissed the story again, thinking it was just a coincidence. That night, as I drove back through the forest, the rain started pouring down heavily, making the road more dangerous. But I kept going, just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, through the rain, I saw another woman. But this time, she wasn't alone, and in her arms was a child who looked frail, almost lifeless. I intended to drive past. I hesitated, but my conscience wouldn't let me. I stopped and asked if they needed a ride. She looked pale, like she'd been out in the rain for too long. She nodded gratefully and climbed into my car with the child in her arms. I handed them a towel to dry off, and then she directed me to a hospital. When we arrived, she quietly thanked me before heading into the building. I sighed with relief, but as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the back of the car. It was the black umbrella she had been carrying. It was still in my car, and when I turned to look back at the hospital, I was almost paralyzed with what I saw. I looked away for just a few seconds, and when I looked back, they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the rain. Feeling confused, I decided it was best to leave as soon as possible. As I neared home, the rain was still pouring, and the parking lot was quite far from my house, so I had to use the black umbrella left in my truck. However, I felt a bit hesitant to use it, remembering that it belonged to the woman and her son, but I had no other choice. As I was walking, a strong gust of wind almost tore the umbrella from my hand, and suddenly, a wooden beam came crashing down from above, about to fall on me. It could have killed me, but the umbrella somehow pulled me to the side, saving my life. Shaking, I realized the umbrella wasn't just an ordinary umbrella. Perhaps it was a gift the woman left behind to protect me. The next morning, I went back to the grocery store, determined to uncover the truth. The shopkeeper hesitated, but finally told me the whole story. The woman and her child were spirits, doomed to wander the forest after a tragic accident. She died trying to protect her son. It happened on a stormy night when she was shunned and refused help by passing travelers. Some even splashed her with mud. She used her body to shield the child, but unfortunately, she slipped and fell off a cliff. On rainy days, if drivers refused to give her a ride, she would mysteriously appear in their cars and haunt them. Feeling a deep sense of injustice, she continues to seek out and punish those who don't help them. The old woman, unable to bear the unbearable pain of losing her daughter and grandson, went mad shortly after. Since that horrific accident, the villagers have often seen her holding a black umbrella, muttering nonsense. With a heavy heart, I visited their graves, returned the umbrella, and expressed my gratitude. As I walked away, I knew my life had changed forever. I had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, and from that day on, I would never doubt their existence again. The Haunting of Route 23. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, driving on long, desolate highways at all hours. As a truck driver, I've gotten used to isolation, to the silence of the road. As a truck driver, I've also had to get used to sometimes sleeping in dangerous places. I was driving along Route 23, a road known for its long, deserted stretches. It's a 30-mile stretch of highway surrounded by endless rows of trees and dark tunnels. I had been driving for 3 hours, and I usually stop for a break after 4. I didn't particularly like this road, but I had no other choice. I spotted a small parking lot up ahead, a flat patch of land nestled between the trees. It was just big enough for my truck. I turned in and parked there. The dense trees surrounded me with a sense of desolation and silence. I stepped outside to brush my teeth. While brushing, I heard the sound of an engine echoing in the distance. A car was approaching, but instead of passing by, it slowly crept closer. Its windows were dark, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to the safety of my truck, slamming the door shut. I wrapped the seatbelt around the handle, an old trucker's trick, to make it harder for anyone to open the door from the outside. I had done this many times before in dangerous places, but tonight, it felt necessary. I pulled the curtain shut and lay down on the bed in the back of the truck, covering myself with the blanket. But the fatigue from the long drive soon took over, and within minutes, I was fast asleep. It felt like I had just closed my eyes when a noise woke me up. It was footsteps, soft and slow, circling the truck. Then they stopped right outside the driver's door. Then came a loud, violent knock on the door. I jolted up, almost falling out of bed. The knocking on the door grew more frantic, more aggressive. My hands fumbled as I tried to shove my shoes on. I shouted, "Who's out there?" But there was no answer, just the banging getting louder. I rushed to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life. I pulled the curtain aside, ready to drive off. And that's when I saw him. A man, dressed all in black, stood just inches from the truck. He held a large knife in one hand and a hammer in the other. We locked eyes, and he twisted his face into a grotesque, maniacal grin. He seemed unhinged. Then he lifted the knife in front of me, as if taunting and provoking me. My truck suddenly stalled. I hit the horn, warning him I would charge if he didn't back off. But instead of retreating, the man started walking toward me. He quickened his pace. Then he started sprinting toward me, yelling as he ran. The knife and hammer swung wildly in his hands as he charged at the truck. I realized my window was still cracked open. I reached to close it, but before I could, his face was pressed against the glass. His wild eyes stared into mine. He grinned, nodding toward the window. With a sudden swing, the hammer smashed against the driver's side window. The glass shook but held. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the engine. Another swing. This time, the glass shattered. A third swing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the window. It was about to give completely. My life hung by a thread. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas just as the window opened. The man screamed as the truck lunged forward, throwing him off balance. His hammer was still lodged in the broken window as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stand up. He stood in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. His silhouette was clearly visible in the mirror. I haven't driven like that since. That night taught me to always be prepared, to plan my route down to the smallest detail. Now, I sleep in safer places, far from empty parking lots. Red bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait! Wait!
The man called out. She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted,
Help me! Help me! Help me!
As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. Well, you. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?
I replied, I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue. She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. Blue flames. I live in a suburb where there aren't many opportunities for hiking or camping. I will go camping for the first time in a remote forest. I think it will be a perfect camping trip because the land is flat. At the end of the trail, there will be a small pond. I walked for about an hour, but was a bit disappointed as it was quite small and surrounded by mud. However, it was enough for me to experience lying on a boat in the midst of nature. Suddenly, a thick mist crept through the bushes, clinging to the ground like a living entity that looked like a zombie rising from a grave. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of birds chirping echoed back, strangely distorted, indescribable. After setting up the tent in a drier spot, I asked him to take a walk around the lake because I saw quite a lot of interesting things around here. I wandered over to the other side of the pond, and there wasn't really much there, so I tried to go deeper. I suddenly discovered a mound of earth that looked like something had been buried recently, and it gradually emitted a very unpleasant smell. I turned my back. The fog was thick, covering the ghostly road, cold, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to head back to my camp, and by then, the sun was almost setting. I had a small lighter with me, so I used it to light a campfire and heat some food. I sat eating and chatting about everything with Tin. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. I was confused, wondering if there was anyone else out here besides us. Maybe I had disturbed them? As the sun set, I noticed a light hovering across the pond. It was within the trees just outside the pond, but I had walked there an hour earlier and knew there was nothing there. Tin jokingly said it might be a will-o'-the-wisp and that I should be careful or it would take me away. We joked around and then acted like nothing happened. At night, occasionally, I glanced over at the pond a bit. I wasn't sure what to do, but an hour later into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye that the light began to fade, and suddenly, a blue light flickered in the air and then disappeared. I didn't dare call Tin because he would punch me. I stared into the dark forest, feeling empty again. For about 10 minutes, I waited for the light to turn back on, but it didn't appear. That gave me chills, but I figured I must have been seeing things or dreaming. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness when my friend and I were suddenly awakened by a howling sound. Lights started flickering in front of the camp. I thought they were fireflies, so I asked Tin to go see because you rarely see this in the city. Tin and I decided to go on an adventure together. I must say we were really brave despite being a bit scared. Going deeper, the path opened up to a small clearing, surrounded by spindly trees with arrows on them. We immediately followed. Suddenly it was a mound. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. I approached and saw an ancient stone ring full of moss half buried in the ground. The air is thick with unspeakable fear, as if the stones themselves hold the memory of horrors. The tiny lights began to gather, swirling around each other to form a magical circle. This light illuminated the ground, creating strange patterns. My curiosity began to rise as I moved closer to take a closer look. I couldn't see clearly, but somewhere from under the mound of earth, something that looked like a horribly rotten hand like in those zombie movies emerged from the ground. Then the blue flames began to fly out rapidly like evil fireflies wanting to eat us, causing us to panic and not be able to run in time until we fell covered in mud. We started to panic. I screamed and waved a stick around instinctively, but Tin, being braver, took out his phone to take pictures. Moments later, we mysteriously lost consciousness and woke up near our tent. When I looked around, the blue light had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hooting of an owl. Tin, he took out his phone to check. The photos no longer seemed like a spiritual phenomenon. Just as dawn was breaking, we were too terrified and quickly left the forest, praying as we hurried away and vowing never to return. When I got back, I researched and found out that the forest was cursed with an ancient spell, which is why few people visit. We had gone without knowing. It was fortunate that we were still alive. Horror Story Haunted Tracks. The legend of the haunted tracks had always been a topic of eerie fascination in our small town. The story went that, decades ago, a tragic train accident had occurred on the old, abandoned railway line just outside town. Many lives were lost that fateful night, and it was said that the spirits of the victims still lingered, haunting the area. As a skeptic, I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, but that changed one cold winter night. I was driving back home after visiting a friend when a heavy snowstorm hit, making the roads nearly impassable. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing, hoping to save some time. The wind howled, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the narrow, winding road. The visibility was almost zero, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I approached the old crossing, my car suddenly stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, the biting cold stinging my face and hands. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint, distant whistle. I froze, remembering the tales of the haunted tracks. The whistle grew louder, and I saw a light piercing through the snowstorm, heading straight toward me. Panic set in as I realized it was an old steam train, barreling down the tracks at an alarming speed. I abandoned my car and tried to run, but the snow was too deep, and I stumbled. As the train approached, I could see it more clearly. A rusted, ancient locomotive, its windows shattered, and the metal twisted and scorched. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the train passed right through me, sending a bone-chilling cold through my body. I turned to see it continue down the tracks, disappearing into the storm. Shaking, I returned to my car and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I wasted no time getting back on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached home, I was too shaken to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Mark about the experience. Mark, a local history buff, was intrigued and suggested we investigate the site together. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we headed to the old railway crossing that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear night. The tracks looked abandoned, covered in snow and rusted with age. As we walked along the line, Mark recounted the details of the accident. A collision between two trains due to a signaling error, killing dozens of passengers. Suddenly, we heard it again, the distant whistle. The air grew colder, and a light appeared down the tracks. We watched in disbelief as the same ghostly train emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward us. Mark, braver than I, stepped forward with his camera, snapping pictures. The train passed through us again, leaving us both shivering and breathless. When we reviewed the photos, we were stunned. In each shot, ghostly figures were visible. Faces twisted in pain and fear, hands pressed against the windows as if pleading for help. We had captured the spirits of the victims, forever trapped on their final, tragic journey. The haunted tracks were no longer just a legend. They were a grim reminder of the lives lost and the restless souls that still wandered, seeking peace. I never took that shortcut again, and the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a chilling testament to the power of the supernatural. Ghosts at the theater. Jane was a beautiful woman. She often filmed famous or mysterious locations with her crew, doing whatever it took to gain fame. Today, Jane was standing in the bathroom of the Birdcage Theater, also known as the Birdcage Theater in Arizona, which was now out of operation. Surrounded by whispers about the past, she looked in the mirror and applied lipstick with excitement welling up inside her. Hundreds of thousands of followers are waiting for her latest video, and she plans to take them on a dramatic journey about the haunted history of this famous theater. It is famous for its cruel history of violence and death. As she leaned closer to the mirror, something blurred at the edge of her vision. An indistinct shape hovered behind her. Startled, she screamed and quickly turned back to look. That surprise was from her boyfriend, Ken. He responded with an amused and teasing attitude. She started complaining about him scaring her. But after the laughter and teasing, she still felt something truly behind her, making her think about the curses that haunted this place. Ken set up the phone, urging her to start recording, and Jane was ready to begin. Through her journeys exploring haunted houses and places, she had built an online persona as someone who delved into the paranormal. Sharing such stories made her following grow continuously. Her sixth sense leads her to supernatural encounters. She begins to tell the dark, mysterious stories behind this Birdcage Theater. She started passing places like bars and old tables that made her feel a dark energy around her. Jane shivered and continued, recounting stories of gunfights and dreams. Broken ended life here. Suddenly, the piano in the corner played a faint, haunting melody. It was only a few notes, but they seemed to echo endlessly. Jane kept her camera steady, moving toward the staircase. As she climbed the stairs, she suddenly felt like she heard the mournful cry of someone, seemingly a woman. She carefully looked around. There was no one else, or any changes. She started to turn to ask Ken, but it seemed like no one heard that except me. Finally, she reached the theater's dressing room. The room was dark, with faded, peeling wallpaper at the corners. Jane felt a sharp, terrible pain in her heart as she stepped inside. She started sitting against the wall, trying to breathe. Ken worriedly told her to stop, but she was stubborn and determined to have footage at this place. Jane begins to recall the tragic gossip story of Margarita, a dancer and aspiring actress. She is in her prime. She was murdered by her own colleague in this very room. She was stabbed through the heart with a high heel by someone envious of her success. It was said that her spirit haunted the room, seeking revenge or even a way to live again. Despite the lingering pain, Jane was intrigued. She was a bit scared, but couldn't ignore Margarita's ghost story. It would complete her video perfectly. She returned to the bathroom to prepare. When she stood in front of the mirror, something was different. Jane leaned closer, squinting into the darkness. That's when she actually saw something. A ghostly figure stood behind me, his face pale and painted, his eyes sunken and dark. She wore an old dress, her expression a distorted mixture of longing and anger. I feel like maybe it's Margarita. She quickly raised her phone to record a video. The pain returned, piercing her chest like a blade, but Jane persisted in capturing her reflection on the glass. After a while, Ken didn't see Jane anywhere. Worried, he went to check near the restroom. The door was wide open, and he saw Jane acting very strangely. He was shocked to see Jane standing in front of the mirror, talking to herself, and he asked if she was okay. She slowly turned to look at Ken from head to toe and said, "Who are you?" Her words sounded strange, foreign. Her eyes widened in confusion. He chuckled awkwardly, thinking I was pulling one of my usual dark jokes. Clearly, there was some truth being overlooked. Ken led that girl out of the theater, unaware that his real girlfriend was trapped in the mirror, freeing a vengeful spirit. Jane was bound to this place with no escape. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Unheard, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. She was trapped. Perhaps she had been possessed when Jane started filming Margarita. Margarita had stolen Jane's life and identity, and now she was out in the world, free to pursue the fame that had been taken from her long ago. In the days that followed, Jane's social media was filled with increasingly strange and terrifying posts. Her followers loved the change, but no one knew they weren't following Jane, they were following Margarita, who was dead and now replacing Jane. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence. whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Ema suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Ema made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looked sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late, every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. "Hi." I frowned. "Who was this?" I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. "You don't know who this is?" I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound, a knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. "I'm here." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
Here, help me.
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask. The wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move. And he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it, a door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, the man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, Casey, we need to call the police. Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. They're trying to get in, I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Call the police, I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, we need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door. With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, "Maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all." Trucker's Secret Mission. Another long and quiet night on the highway. The road stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. I had been driving this road for years, working undercover as a long-haul truck driver. My real job was much more dangerous, tracking criminals, operating on these desolate roads under the cover of darkness. I am an undercover cop. My truck is my weapon, my disguise, and my hideout. Tonight was supposed to be like any other night, but I had a feeling, something gnawing at the back of my mind, telling me that tonight would be different, so I needed to be extra cautious. The road was deserted. The only sounds were my engine and the occasional rustle of wind over the barren landscape. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning the distance for any signs of trouble. Criminals often use these isolated highways to conduct their business, and I've made it my mission to stop them. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside, waving for me to stop. It was late, too late for anyone to be out here. My instincts kicked in immediately. Something was off. I slowed down and stopped by the roadside. The man approached, his face shrouded in darkness. He looked disheveled, almost deranged. As he got closer, I could see his clothes were torn and filthy. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, and there was a wild look in his eyes. I cautiously rolled down my window. "Do you need help?" But there was something about this guy, something dangerous. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled a slow, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. Then, he pulled something out from under his coat, a small black box. I recognized it immediately. It was a vial containing a dangerous, illegal substance, something that could be lethal on contact. My heart beats fast. This is no ordinary hitchhiker. He is a dangerous man, and his target is me. The man stepped closer, holding the vial in one hand and a small knife in the other. "Get out of the truck," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you don't make it through the night." I knew what was in that vial. It was a more dangerous weapon than the knife he held. Just one drop could incapacitate me, or worse, kill me. He knew it too. That's why he smiled like that. I kept my cool. My training kicked in. I had dealt with guys like him before, unpredictable and dangerous. But this time was different. He wasn't just a criminal, he was playing a twisted game, and I was his target tonight. I slowly unlocked the door, my mind racing as I tried to think of my next move. The man continued to smile, his eyes gleaming with some sick satisfaction. "Come on," he taunted, waving the knife. "Get out of the truck, Brian." I froze. How did he know my name? I had never met this guy in my life, yet he knew who I was. He stepped closer, holding up the vial. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Driving around here pretending to be a hero, catching guys like me. I've been watching you for a long time." The truth hit me like a punch. This wasn't random. He had planned this, but maybe he didn't know I was really a cop. I climbed out of the truck, raising my hands to show compliance. My mind raced, searching for an opportunity. The man circled around me, still grinning like a madman. He sneered, starting to pace back and forth, waving the knife and vial as he spoke. His words grew more erratic. He muttered something about me stealing it from him, but I couldn't even remember what it was. I racked my brain, trying to recall him. I had taken down countless criminals in my time. Drug dealers, traffickers, murderers. Any of them could have a grudge. But this guy, his face didn't ring any bells. His eyes burned with hatred as he said, "Now I'm going to ruin your life." He stepped closer, waving the vial in front of me. He whispered, "Just one drop, and it'll all be over." I stood still, watching his every move. He was too close, too confident. He thought he had won, but he was careless, distracted by his own need for revenge. Suddenly, luck was on my side. As he rambled, I noticed a flaw in his plan, the way he loosely held the knife. How distracted he was. He was too immersed in his own twisted game. Luckily, every time I went on a mission, I always wore gloves to protect myself from hazardous materials. Without warning, I lunged forward, knocking the vial from his hand. sending it skidding across the pavement. He was shocked, but not for long. He swung the knife at me, but I was ready because I had been through it and knew how to handle it. I grabbed his wrist and twisted until he dropped the blade. The struggle was quick and brutal. I used every trained skill to subdue him, pinning him to the ground before he could react. He thrashed, cursing and screaming, but it was over. I had him. As I held him down, panting from the exertion, I asked, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" He just laughed a cold, empty laugh. I stared at him, the pieces falling into place. He was one of the first criminals I had ever apprehended, a drug trafficker. He didn't forget I waited, planned, burned my hatred for years. I squeezed him. His words stabbed deeper than any weapon. He didn't pursue money or drugs or even freedom. He pursues revenge aimlessly and empty. Once he was subdued, I discreetly pressed for backup, making sure no one knew my true identity, while I waited for the other officers to arrive. I couldn't shake the chill down my spine. This man, this forgotten criminal, had built his entire life around destroying me. The lights of the patrol cars approached. This job wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about the shadows that follow you, carrying grudges from the past that never truly go away. My colleagues took him away. For every criminal I took down, there would be another waiting, another with a grudge, another seeing me as the one who ruined their lives. But now I understood more. The real danger wasn't out there on the road. It was in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again, the sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nikki spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nikki stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. Abandoned house on Halloween. The dim light of Halloween decorations danced on the walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to come alive. This was the day I had always looked forward to. My friends were out gathering candy, but I was too anxious to join them this year. As I stared into the flickering light of the TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that this Halloween would be different. Finally, I gathered the courage to step outside. I trudged down the street, admiring the carved pumpkins and spooky decorations adorning the houses. I approached a house at the end of the block that I had never noticed before. The house looked abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and overgrown weeds. A shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity drew me closer. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed a flickering light inside. My heart raced. Should I knock? The porch creaked beneath my feet, and I took a deep breath before raising my hand to the door. Before I could knock, the door swung open on its own, revealing a pitch-black entrance. The smell of mildew and rot hit my nose, and I hesitantly called out to see if anyone was home. But it was completely silent, so I cautiously stepped inside. Darkness stretched across the walls, and I could see old furniture covered in dust sheets. I spotted an old pumpkin lantern flickering in the corner, its flame casting dancing shadows. I felt a strange pull toward the back of the house, where I saw a flickering light coming through a window. I cautiously made my way down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. My heart raced as I approached the doorway, the light growing brighter. But as I reached for the doorknob, a sudden chill ran down my spine. I paused, sensing an unsettling energy in the air. Then, without warning, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned to see the door I had just passed through slowly closing, as if someone or something was pushing it shut. Panic surged within me. I forced the door open, only to reveal a cluttered living room shrouded in darkness. And then, there he was. An old man sat in a rocking chair, dressed in tattered clothes, with a long beard and wild hair. His eyes sunk deep into his face. He rocked slowly back and forth, making the chair creak in the silence, thickening the atmosphere. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I couldn't take my eyes off his movements. As I took a step back, wanting to retreat, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged within me. I was trapped in this old, eerie house with a strange, terrifying man. Suddenly, the old man spoke, his voice hoarse and deep. "You've come for the treats, haven't you?" My throat tightened as I nodded slowly, fear coursing through me. I could hardly make out his features in the dim light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of something that looked like candy, extending his hand toward me, saying it was specially for me. But something felt off. It looked dark and uninviting. Just then, I heard a crash from another room, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I needed to get out. I dashed toward the front door, my heart racing as I pulled on the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. I twisted and struggled to open it in desperation. The old man's laughter echoed behind me, sending chills down my spine. "Stay a while. I have plenty of candy," he called, his voice dripping with malice. Panic surged within me as I pulled at the front door, but it stubbornly remained shut. The old man's laughter echoed around me, filling me with dread. I glanced back at him, the flickering lantern casting eerie shadows that made him appear even more terrifying. My My mind raced with fear and desperation for a way out. I stepped back from the door and scanned the room for another exit. I spotted a window on the far side, partially obscured by tattered curtains. That was when he stood up. He took a step closer. "You shouldn't be here, kid." Ignoring him, I rushed toward the window, fear propelling me forward. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers trembling, but it was stuck tight. I felt tears welling up as if some unseen force was preventing me from escaping the darkness of this house. I glanced back at the old man, who was now only inches away, his smile widening with delight as he watched me trapped. In a moment of desperation, I looked back down the dark hallway that led further into the house. Perhaps there was another escape route. I dashed forward, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of being watched. The flickering lantern behind me illuminated strange images painted on the walls, pictures of children, lost and weeping. My heart raced as I reached another door at the end of the hallway. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. The kitchen was eerily quiet, filled with the stench of decay and rot. I glanced around, searching for an exit. The back door appeared at the end, partially ajar, promising freedom. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards behind me. I turned to see the old man stepping into the kitchen, blocking my only escape. His voice was hoarse as he stared at me. "We're just getting started." I threw myself against the door, desperate to escape. The door swung open, and I tumbled into the backyard. As I turned back after the fall, the terrifying face of the old man loomed before me. I felt breathless at the sight of him. Despite the pain from my fall, I didn't hesitate any longer. I bolted through the yard, glancing back to see the old man standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light of the kitchen. I reached the fence surrounding the backyard, my mind racing. The only escape was over the tall wooden slats, but I had no time to hesitate. I climbed up, my fingers gripping the splintered wood, heart pounding as I launched myself over to the other side. I landed awkwardly in the neighbor's yard, rolling to my feet and sprinting into the street. Not only that, terror surged as I hit the ground. The neighbor's dog burst out, barking furiously as if it wanted to devour me. I panicked, crawling on the ground to escape this madness. I could hear nothing but the blood pounding in my ears as I ran onto the main road. The Halloween decorations lining the street now looked terrifying, their shadows stretching under the moonlight. I sprinted down the street, glancing back at the house. Terrified the old man was watching me. I couldn't slow down. I needed to get home, to safety. Each breath became labored as I turned the corner, and the familiar sight of my house came into view. I burst through the gate and rushed to the front door, my fingers fumbling at the lock as I desperately tried to get inside. I flung the door open and stumbled into the safety of my home. Gasping for breath, heart pounding, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it immediately and sliding down against the door. My mom was still at work, and the house felt eerily quiet. As I peered outside, a figure moved through the yard. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, but thankfully it was just a neighbor walking their dog. I exhaled, relief flooding through me, but it didn't last long. As I lay in bed that night, darkness enveloped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man was still out there, waiting in the shadows. Perhaps this Halloween would be one filled with terror for me.